Hello, and welcome to Politics in a Movie with your hosts, Doug and Mike. I'm Doug.
And I'm Mike.
And this week's episode, the Harry S. Truman Presidency and Goldfinger.
Goldfinger!
As always, Mike, we do want to thank our colleague behind the scenes, Frenchie, or as he would say, Couleg. So, Mike, a lot of our listeners, they give us opinions as to how we should pair a movie for a given
time. How dare they? How dare they?
Yeah. But as the experts here, we're going to go with Goldfinger for reasons that may become apparent as we continue.
Maybe.
Yeah. And you know what they say about people's opinions, Mike?
What do they say?
That a lot of people frequently have them.
I've heard that.
Yeah. All right. So, as many people may know from the last episode, we had a polling. We had two questions that we were asking on our website. Who did the best Jimmy Stewart impression? And in regards to Uncle Billy in It's a Wonderful Life, did you feel sorry for him or did you sort of hate him?
I really hate that man.
I felt sorry for him.
Well, okay. Well, let's see what the people said. Frenchie is giving me the tallied summaries. And all right, here we go. For the best Jimmy Stewart impression, Mike, you got 10% of the vote.
Okay.
I got 45%.
Excellent.
So, as to be expected, I feel I'm pretty good at
it.
But we also gave people the option to vote for both of us, and that was 45% also. So I tied for you and me.
Interesting.
Yeah. All right. And then on the Uncle Billy, it was right down the line, 50-50. So, well, there you go. We'll keep doing polls every now and then, Mike.
Sure.
All right. Well, with that, Mike, we're going to jump right into our political segment, the Harry S. Truman Presidency.
Got it. Okay. Well, Harry S. Truman was the 33rd president of the United States, and he was the second to last to have been born in the 1800s. And perhaps the last president elected with no college degree.
Oh.
He was a Missouri farm boy who served in the U.S. Army in World War I and later owned a haberdashery. Do you know what a haberdashery is, Doug?
I think it is a place that sells and makes hats.
I'm sorry. That's the wrong answer.
Suits, Doug. They make suits.
But also hats.
Maybe hats, but they sold suits.
Okay, good.
He and a buddy from the Army opened a haberdashery in Kansas City after they served in the Army. And he was plucked from obscurity by machine boss of Kansas City, Tom Pendergast, to serve as judge. He was elected judge, but then he was elected Missouri senator, again, with the help of machine boss Tom Pendergast. Some called him the senator from Pendergast as sort of a sly dig.
Interesting. Yeah, so that name Pendergast, that reminds me of something in that movie Ready Player One, where some guy's known for like messing things up, and it generates the term pulling a Pendergast.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, like, if you're a knucklehead doing something stupid, it's called pulling a Pendergast. I actually knew a guy named Pendergast. And, well, I'm not going to say more than that.
So he was serving as senator from Missouri, again, a farm boy, didn't go to college. And the Democrats decided that they wanted to replace the unpopular liberal who had been vice president under FDR, Franklin Roosevelt. And so in 1944, at the convention, they replaced Henry Wallace, basically because they were worried about Roosevelt's health. Roosevelt, as you know, was plagued by polio.
Oh, okay.
And was paralyzed from the waist down.
Wow. Yeah. And that was way before there was a vaccine, right?
Yes. Yep. But FDR was very popular. He was elected 4 times and served 12 years.
Yeah.
So he was, king of America.
I'm the king of the world!
And he easily won the election in 1944 with Truman. Truman becomes vice president, and just 82 days after being sworn in as vice president, he became president on April 12th, 1945, when Franklin Roosevelt died. Roosevelt was only 63
Oh, okay.
which is
That's young.
hard to believe. You see pictures of him. He didn't look good.
Wow.
He didn't look 63.
Yeah. But he had polio.
But he had polio, but he
That's
was,
got to take a toll.
yep. And he had leg braces, and he famously, would get pulled up out of his seat to make speeches standing up in his leg braces.
Right.
His son, adult son would hold him up, which I think must have been a difficult job.
Yeah.
And, you'd see FDR giving speeches, and his son was right next to him, and he was holding him up. And he would go to Warm Springs, Georgia for therapy. Evidently, he felt that the springs, the hot springs in Georgia, were therapeutic for his legs. And they called the Georgia place the Little White House.
Oh,
where he would go in Georgia.
I bet that was there. I bet that was therapeutic.
Well, Roosevelt thought so.
Made in Georgia.
So on April 12th, 1945, just 82 days after being sworn in as vice president, Truman became president. So some thought Truman was unprepared. Despite not being educated and not having a college degree, Truman was studied Latin for fun, and was a musician, played the piano. He famously would play the piano in the White House for, visiting dignitaries.
I wonder if it was like really good music that he was playing, or if he was like playing chopsticks. You think like a dignitary would show up and he would be like playing dun 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 dun, and then they would just kind of smile and clap politely.
Doug, I think he was pretty good. He used to study the score of the symphony and bring copies of it to the symphony. He was a big buff, symphony buff. Nice. And so he would like to read along while, the orchestra was playing. He would read along and follow with the musical score. Yeah. So he was a smart guy, well-read, liked to read Latin for fun. I mean, who doesn't, right? And, he came on August 12th, 1945. He was sworn in as president. Eleanor Roosevelt called Truman and said, the president has died, so you need to come down to the White House. They called the Chief Justice, who was then Harlan Stone, and Stone comes to the White House and swears in Truman.
Okay.
Yeah. And also present is Secretary of War George Marshall. And George Marshall pulls Truman aside and says, listen, I've got to tell you about this weapon that we have that we're working on. So this is Truman first hearing about the famous Manhattan Project and the atomic bomb.
Right. Now, so is it his first, like he was left in the dark, even though he was.
He was.
Interesting.
And I think people thought at this moment, World War II is still going on, and we have a new president who knows nothing about this, Manhattan Project and the atomic bomb, and knows probably not much about. He was sort of kept. I think a lot of vice presidents are kept out of the loop.
Right.
And so,
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Come on, guys. Would I keep you out of the loop, huh?
So Truman steps into the job, and just months later, he attends the UN Charter Conference in San Francisco. And 75 days after he's sworn in, he's in San Francisco and signs the new UN Charter, creating the UN on June 26, 1945. He makes a statement to the country. New President Truman, not the 12-year, 4-term FDR, who's making this grand announcement of the United Nations. I think the country was probably shocked.
You're the new guy, right? Yeah. You ever wonder why there was a job opening?
But here he is, stepping up to the task.
Yeah.
Creating the UN and a lot more. The Marshall Plan is what they call this Economic Recovery Act that followed the war. That was signed into law in 1947, a couple of years later. But let's go back again to 1945. He signs the UN Charter, and then on August 6th, the atomic bomb is dropped on Hiroshima.
A short time ago, an American airplane dropped one bomb on Hiroshima. Let there be no mistake. We shall completely destroy Japan's power to make war.
Wow. Yeah, that's so he signed into creation the United Nations, huh?
Yes.
In San Francisco, even though the United Nations official building is in New York, right?
Yeah, well, it didn't exist yet. So,
okay. So
I don't know who who planned this conference, but it was planned before Truman was president. FDR was to have attended in San Francisco. So that's where on June 25th, 1945, the UN was chartered and Harry Truman signed the charter for the US.
Cool.
Yeah. And then August 6th, an atomic bomb is dropped on Hiroshima. On August 9th, another one is dropped on Nagasaki.
Right.
August 15th, Japan surrenders.
Yeah.
So, there's a lot of discussion about this. I remember years ago having a discussion with a friend, and we're talking about Harry Truman. He says, "I hate Harry Truman." I was like, "Oh, really? Why?" And he said, "Well, because he dropped the bomb." So, there can be a lot of discussion about this. And a lot of people will say, yes, it killed a lot of people, and it did. But what would have happened if we hadn't dropped the bomb? There probably would have been a land invasion of Japan, would have dragged on for a long time. The argument is that many more people would have died on both sides.
Right.
So, yes, it was a horrible, horrible thing.
So before he was president, all this was already in motion.
Yep.
It was a Manhattan Project. They were already talking about dropping the bomb, right?
Yep.
It's just bad luck for Truman that he was sitting in the seat when the decision had to officially be made.
There was a little bit of, the train is already moving, and Truman just hops into the seat that Roosevelt had been filling, and, it was in motion, and he carried it through. We'll never know if FDR would have done the same, but it seemed like FDR and those in that Roosevelt administration had been planning the Manhattan Project. And if you watched Oppenheimer, you see that it was a race against the Nazis. We didn't want the Nazis to get the atomic bomb first. So, moving ahead, Truman puts in place what's called the Marshall Plan, and that is the European Recovery Act, the Economic Recovery Act. It was actually signed in 1947, but the plan was to rebuild and provide economic and political assistance to those nations that were hurt by the war. And they were going to rebuild who had been our enemies, Germany and Japan. And it was called the Marshall Plan after George Marshall, who was now Secretary of State, previously the general of the Allied forces. In addition to the Marshall Plan, there was the Truman Doctrine. This was basically the philosophy that the U.S. will provide military, economic, and political assistance to democratic nations who are threatened by authoritarian forces.
From now on, it means that anti-communist America will make its influence felt in European affairs.
So it's this is primarily a goal that was a deterrent to the expansion of the Soviet bloc. In 1947, the National Security Act is passed, which the OSS, which had been in the Department of Defense, becomes the CIA. And I add this because this is really the beginning of the Cold War. The Allies are now changing their priorities, away from World War II. The Allies and the other side, so it's, the Soviets had been our allies. Now are they becoming our adversaries?
The entity will know precisely how to undermine our every strength.
How to turn our allies into enemies and our enemies into aggressors.
The Truman Doctrine was basically saying the U.S. will provide assistance to these democratic nations because we didn't want this expansion of the Soviet bloc of communist nations. Basically, and those allied nations also become, with the leadership of Truman and others, NATO. Those Western Europe and, the U.S. and Canada become the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And we basically agree that we will, the NATO, any act on our NATO allies is an act against us. It's considered an act against the U.S.
Right. And that's a core tenet of the NATO treaty. And so we're saying that the Truman Doctrine turned into NATO?
Yep. You could say that.
I did say that. Would you say that?
So, this is a little bit of a transition into our movie, which is really about spies and the Cold War.
Yeah.
Furthering along what Truman did, though, after he was elected, he was responsible for the Marshall Plan, the rebuilding of Europe and Japan. So he did that. But then he also desegregated the military and the civil service.
Oh.
And a lot of people feel that this was the beginning of a civil rights movement that was happening in the United States. But Truman was really at the forefront when he integrated the armed services and civil service.
Oh, okay.
And so for the first time, people, black and white, people of different races were serving together in the military and in the civil service.
That desegregation order moved forward the campaign for equal rights, fair opportunities, and promotions for minority troops in the military.
Well, that's good.
Yeah, he should definitely get credit for that. So moving on, Truman runs again for president in 1948. And he wasn't as popular as FDR. Perhaps it was just a comparison that Truman just suffered in comparison. But going into 1948, pollsters, they did not think Truman was going to win. So Truman is running against the governor of New York, Thomas Dewey. The pollsters were all predicting a Dewey victory. Yeah. And so election day comes and goes. The day after the election, newspapers are printing Dewey defeats Truman.
Oh, right. Now I remember seeing those.
Yeah,
clips.
there's pictures all the time. And Truman proudly holds up these newspapers that say Dewey defeats Truman.
Right.
And the fact was Truman defeated Dewey.
Yeah.
Yeah. So let me give you the results of that 1948 election.
Oh, please.
So Truman and his vice president choice was Alvin Barkley.
Alvin!
And they received 303 electoral votes to Dewey Warren 189. The popular vote was 49.6% to 45.1%. Close election. An electoral college landslide.
And on the Dewey side, you said Warren. Is that the same guy who was involved in the JFK investigation later?
It was. Yes, the
Oh,
Warren
okay.
Commission. Yeah.
Yeah, the Warren Commission, right? right.
Yep.
Look at that. I plucked that out
Good
of
one,
my
Doug.
memory bank.
Yeah, good one. Good one. I just want to say that I think Truman really embodies the notion that anybody can be president. Not college educated farm boy rises to become president. That really is the story of America.
Yeah, Mike. I mean, that's a really good point. It makes me think of some famous quote where they talked about, some people achieve greatness and some people have greatness thrust upon them.
I love that quote. That's a good one.
Yeah, and that's a perfect example.
It is.
Here, although I have to tell you, Mike, I'm a little bit on the fence as to whether I feel comfortable about people becoming president with no qualifications. But I'm of the opinion where I want our president to be extremely well educated and well versed and know a lot about our history, know a lot about our legal process, et cetera, et cetera. But it sounds like, he was a smart fella, but he was mostly self-taught.
So was Abraham Lincoln.
Yeah. All right, Mike. Well, that was a lot of information about Harry Truman that I did not know.
Absolutely.
James Bond really started in that whole era of Cold War. And, the UN and NATO, they're both featured in a lot of Bond movies. And so now, on to Goldfinger. So, Mike, Goldfinger was the third James Bond film. It was made in 1964. And it was made for $3 million back then. And it grossed back then $125 million. So
Nice.
Substantially more. In today's dollars, that would be like grossing $1.2 billion.
Wow.
So it was a tremendously successful film. And it was written by Ian Fleming, who had written a whole series of Bond novels. James Bond was a character in a whole set of novels initially before it became made into films. He wrote his first Bond story in 1952, and it was entitled Casino Royale. Fleming was in the British Naval Intelligence during World War II, and so he was familiar with how intelligence organizations worked. He based a lot of the characters and stories and plots and things in his novels based on his experiences. Did you know that he actually wrote 14 books, Bond novels?
Wow. Wow.
And the names of his novels actually are used verbatim in a bunch of the films, which is kind of cool. So if you actually happen to like a specific Bond movie, chances are you could track down the book and read the original novel. And because he bases a lot of things in these movies on his personal experience, he gives names to villains and characters based on people that he hated.
Oh, interesting.
In his life. For example, he chose the name Goldfinger after some British architect whose last name is Goldfinger, and his, I guess, the buildings that this guy designed, Fleming despised. Now, talking about the franchise, the Bond franchise, Mike, it's got a combined gross of about $8 billion.
Jeez.
That's US dollars, Mike.
Yeah.
And it's the 5th highest grossing film franchise in history.
Oh.
Can you guess what the biggest one is?
Harry Potter.
Oh, it's a good guess. It's in the top 5, Harry Potter, but the number 1 is the Marvel Cinematic Universe, also known as the MCU.
I am Iron Man.
Of course, it's a little bit unfair because that comprises a whole bunch of different kind of comics into that franchise. But the MCU has grossed around 30 billion.
Wow.
That's a lot more than 8.
Oh, yeah.
Now, there's been 26 core Bond films since the first one, Dr. No, in 1962.
Okay.
And each Bond film, for a while, for like the first 5, each Bond film made more than the last one.
Wow.
So it was a successful franchise from the get-go. Before we talk about Goldfinger specifically, let's just talk about the franchise for a moment. Can you tell me, Mike, how many actors have portrayed Bond?
Oh, 6.
That's right, 6.
You're kidding.
Now, yeah, you got it. And can you name? Let's see how many you can name.
All right. So Sean Connery.
Yep.
Roger Moore.
Mm-hmm.
Daniel Craig. The guy who did Sterling, blah, blah.
All right. Well, I'll give you the one. You said Sterling.
Yeah.
Because you're thinking Remington Steele.
Remington Steele, yeah. Pierce Brosnan, yeah.
Yes. So there's 2 left.
Timothy Dalton, yes. Do I have any left?
That's 5. You've got 5. Yeah. So the one that you're missing, I would say he's actually one of my favorite Bonds, George Lazenby.
You gave a very accurate description.
Oh, right.
He did only one film, 1969's On Her Majesty's Secret Service. I've liked all the actors who've played Bond over the years. And I even liked Timothy Dalton. He only did 2 films. Now, his second Bond film was really the worst Bond film of all time. Like, out of all 26, that's the absolute worst by far. So a lot of people sort of, pan Timothy Dalton as Bond. Timmy! But in the first film, he did a good job, I thought.
So who do you think of all those actors wins in a cage match?
Oh, a cage match. Oh, that's a good question. Well, I'll just tell you that, my pick of the number 1 Bond portrayal is Sean Connery.
Yeah, me too.
He's the GOAT. He's the GOAT of Bonds,
he is,
if you will.
He is. He is. I thought it would be too easy to ask you who your favorite was, so I went with the cage match.
Yeah, I think he probably wins cage match too.
I agree. I agree.
Yeah, and Sean Connery, he did 7 Bond films total.
Wow, yeah.
George Lazenby did 1 in 1969, and then Roger Moore,
he did a lot, didn't he?
Took over and he did 7.
7, okay.
Yeah.
That's who I remember growing up, Roger Moore.
Yeah. Well, I like Roger Moore. It's sort of like apples and oranges a little bit.
Definitely.
As we'll talk more as we go over Goldfinger, fashion plays a big role. And Sean Connery happened to be in those years where fashion was classic. Mm-hmm. And Roger Moore, unfortunately, in my opinion, he was in the 70s where fashion was, Roger Moore, like the high point of fashion for James Bond in the 70s included bell-bottom pants and wide lapels, just like, suits that nobody would wear now except as a joke. Sean Connery was in the classic era of fashion, and we'll talk about that. Roger Moore, he brought a different sort of style to Bond, which I appreciated. And the other day I was watching some of these classic TV episodes that he was in a TV show called The Saint.
Yeah.
For many years.
Mm-hmm.
And some people say that he would have been Bond earlier, but he was tied up in the contract that he had to do with The Saint. Same thing with Pierce Brosnan.
I was going to say, that's very similar.
Going to be James Bond earlier, but he got tied up in Remington Steele. But Roger Moore in The Saint, you watch him, and he is literally the same character as James Bond. you know?
Yeah,
He
yeah.
portrays him the same way, just like, very stylish, very cool, good in a fight, very smart, beats the bad guys. And in fact, the thing that I thought of real interest when he was filming The Saint is he has a great wardrobe, right? In The Saint.
Yeah.
Turns out that he did not like the suits and the blazers that he was given by the wardrobe guy for the TV show. And so he supplied his own wardrobe.
Oh,
Like all of those really nice suits and blazers and ties and all, like that was all his personal wardrobe.
Wow.
I thought that was pretty cool.
Probably from Savile Row in London.
Oh yeah. Okay, so Mike, let's delve into Goldfinger. Sure. The opening of Goldfinger is one of my favorite of all the Bond films.
Definitely.
Just to review, like he comes in scuba gear, in the water,
right?
Shows up on this little, shore and then sneaks into a plant. He plants a bomb,
right?
And then he takes off his scuba jacket to reveal like a nice dinner coat with a black tie.
Yes.
He's got like a full, nice,
yep,
dinner jacket. And
who hasn't done that though?
It's just beautiful. Fun fact, this was reproduced in Schwarzenegger's True Lies opening. He does the same kind of thing. Anyway, so Sean Connery, he casually hangs out at this bar waiting for the bomb. And he's checking his watch, waiting for the bomb to explode. And it explodes. This huge explosion rocks this, this bar. And everyone's in a panic, running around, and the building shakes, right?
Yeah.
And Bond is just calmly, unmoving, just looking at his watch, kind of like, oh, okay, good, It's on time. Everyone around him is running around in a panic, and he's just calmly looking at his watch. And this, Mike, this is the key for James Bond. Unflinching, cool under pressure, always stylish. And he's so calm, Mike, that his contact says to him, oh, the heat's going to be on you now. You better get out of here. Your plane leaves in an hour, right?
Right.
And he says, well, I'll be on it, but I have some unfinished business to attend to. Now, dude, that is coolness under pressure. His flight leaves in an hour, and he still has time for a side task.
There's a plane leaving for Miami in an hour.
I'll be on it, but first I have some unfinished business to attend to.
Right.
I mean, I don't know about you, Mike, but I start stressing out when I have a flight leaving in like 4 hours. Is there going to be traffic on the way to the airport? Am I going to have time to check my bag? Is the TSA line going to be long? Am I wearing the right shoes? I mean, but Bond is just like, oh, an hour? Yeah, no problem. I got a couple things I got to take care of first.
Right.
And so one of those things he has to take care of, Mike, is making out with a girl.
That's right. That's what I was thinking.
Yeah. Now, this is a classic Bond moment,
yes,
making out with a girl. But in this film, what I really love is he feels her tense up, right? When he's kissing her.
Yeah.
So he pulls back and he sees in her eye the reflection of a bad guy.
Yep.
And so he's able to spin around and fight the bad guy and win.
Yep.
But, if you think back, like in this movie was made in the 60s, that's a really well done shot to achieve in film. Like the fact that they put that together. All right. Well, let's talk about the opening song, Mike.
Yes.
I got to tell you, I think that's the best Bond song ever.
Do you want me to sing it?
Oh, I would love you to sing it. I actually sang this song in karaoke once. It was in the catalog, and I was like, oh man, I got to sing that.
Goldfinger,
the man with the Midas touch.
Such a cold finger.
But singing this song, the key is you got to commit. You got to commit to how Shirley Bassey hits those notes, Yeah.
I think the music in the movie is great. I just love the horns, like as the tension is building, I just think it's really it's very classic Bond, and clearly that carried through as they continued with Bond and Austin Powers.
Yeah, that Bond theme song. The Bond theme song, it's like one of the best film theme songs in history.
Yeah. And it sort of cues up the action. You know that big things, exciting things are happening when you hear that dun 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 dun.
Yeah.
Ba-da.
Yeah.
Like it gets you your blood pumping.
It does. It's a good workout theme.
Yeah.
Now this film, Mike, it's got so much excellent cinematography, and the next shot right after the opening credits, it's a long helicopter shot of a Miami Beach hotel.
Yeah.
And the helicopter, like, slowly comes in on the hotel and zooms in on the back where there's a nice, like, Olympic-sized pool and like a 2 or 3 story diving board.
Right.
And a guy dives off the diving board into the pool, and then the opening shot, the camera cuts to the guy diving into the pool, and at this resort, people down in the lower level can see people swimming in the pool. So you see the guy landing in the water. Just a really great shot. And, this Goldfinger was the first Bond movie to win an Academy Award.
Oh.
It won for Best Sound Effects Editing. So I think it should have won for cinematography, but sound effects pretty good.
Yeah.
So right away in the hotel, Bond is put onto tracking Auric Goldfinger. Classic name, Auric.
Yeah.
Auric has the letters AU in it, which is the symbol for gold, as you chemists know. He starts tracking him right away at the hotel. And he foils Goldfinger's card cheating plan, makes him lose, right?
Yep.
He pisses off Goldfinger like right away. Let's talk about the 4 things, in my opinion, that makes a Bond movie a Bond movie. Okay?
Okay.
Number 1, he announces himself, Mike.
Bond. James Bond.
Number 2, gadgets, of course, provided to him by Q, which is short for quartermaster. Did you know that?
I did not.
And we'll talk more about Q in a moment. But in this film, his main gadget is that Aston Martin, the car.
Yeah.
That became so famous.
You'll be using this Aston Martin DB5 with modifications.
So many things became really famous in pop culture after this film. And I love Q. He's always asking for his equipment to come back unbroken, right?
Yeah.
And he's always trying to tutor Bond for like hours as he's explaining these gadgets.
I won't keep you for more than an hour or so if you give me your undivided attention.
You're joking.
I never joke about my work, 007.
And of course, Bond is always screwing with Q. He's always messing with him. Number 3, style and coolness. As we talked about before, Bond is just ultimate cool, ultimate style. His outfits in this film, Mike, they're just awesome. He has a great like blazer and vest when he first meets with M in the beginning at MI6. And then later on, he's got this 3-piece gray suit,
right?
Which is just timeless. Part of his style is also that he knows like the best vintages of like wine and champagne, right?
Right.
He's always like, oh yes, well this tastes like the 65, Burgundy.
Right.
Rather disappointing, Brandy.
Well, what's the matter with it?
I'd say it was a 30-year-old fiend indifferently blended, sir, with an overdose of Bombois.
Colonel Smithers is giving the lecture, 007.
And then number 4, escaping from the bad guy after getting them to monologue. He always gets the villain to like do a bunch of monologuing.
Yeah.
You sly dog! You got me monologuing! I can't believe it.
And then he escapes. And so those 4 things to me, like, make a classic Bond movie. And those things really get defined in Goldfinger and then carry on as a template through almost all the future Bond movies. Mm-hmm. So let's talk a little bit more about Q. So, in the film, it's actually called the Q branch, quartermaster branch. They give out the equipment, and they don't really refer to like the guy, like his nickname isn't Q until later on.
Oh.
Q is famously portrayed by Desmond Llewellyn in 17 films.
Wow.
For 30 plus years, he plays Q, which is impressive. So now, interestingly, Mike, the recent movies with Daniel Craig, right?
Yep.
They started to wean away Q from giving out gadgets, which I just found extremely disappointing. I guess, you know, when those movies were coming, they were sort of competing against the Jason Bourne movies. And so they actually tried to be more like a Jason Bourne, where the character is just more brute force and fighting.
Oh.
You know, and even they don't even have a Q in the first two Daniel Craig movies. It's not until the third one, Skyfall,
okay,
where Q shows up, a younger guy, you know, replacing Desmond, who had done it for 30 plus years, right?
Mm-hmm.
Young guy, young Q, smart guy, who he doesn't give Bond any gadgets, really. He just gives him a few things. And even Bond in the movie complains. He says, so you're just giving me a gun and a radio?
Not exactly Christmas, is it?
Were you expecting an exploding pen? We don't really go in for that anymore.
You know, even Bond is bitching about, where are my gadgets, man? Now, of course, as Q uses, you know, just the initial Q for his name, his code name, M, the head, right? He just goes by M. Now, Fleming got that from the real head of MI5, whose first name was Maxwell, and he'd always sign documents with just an M.
Oh.
And apparently the head of MI6 would just sign everything based on his last name, which had a C in it, and he would just sign it with a C. So that is a thing, just these, like, you know, one-letter nicknames, I guess. By the way, Mike, do you know what MI stands for and the difference between MI5 and MI6?
Military intelligence.
Yes.
5 is, I don't know. What is the difference?
MI5 is their domestic entity. So it's kind of like our FBI. And MI6 is the international one, which is where James Bond is. And that's like our CIA.
Okay.
All right. So moving on in the film, Bond has to meet Goldfinger socially at his golf club.
Yeah.
I own the club.
And there at the golf course, he sees Goldfinger's assistant, Odd Job.
Oh, right. That's a character.
Yeah.
And what's with the hat, the deadly hat that Odd Job has that can slice off, you know, whatever. He throws it like a frisbee and it takes down a tree.
Yeah. He is known for throwing his hat at people because it's got this razor sharp metal ring around it. Yeah. And he even threatens people in the film. He just takes it off and like brandishes it, scare them.
Watch out, I've got a hat.
Yeah, it's kind of silly. Like you gotta know what the hat is for it to really be a threat. But he's just like whipping it out like, now let's talk more about Goldfinger himself.
Right.
Of course, Bond messes with Goldfinger during the golf round, right?
Yeah.
Let's have a little fun with Mr. Goldfinger.
Goldfinger is not happy.
Many people have tried to involve themselves in my affairs, unsuccessfully.
The actor who plays Goldfinger is a German actor, Gert Frobe, who barely spoke any English.
Oh.
And so they started using him, trying to, you know, use his real voice during the dialogue, but it was so stilted and difficult to understand that they just dubbed all of his lines in the whole movie.
Wow. So it's not even his real voice.
Yeah, it's not.
Interesting.
Yeah. And so Goldfinger, he's a corpulent, wealthy, greedy criminal who really loves gold.
All my life I've been in love with its color, its brilliance, its divine heaviness.
He was quite corpulent.
Anyway, he gets captured while he's spying on Goldfinger. Okay. He gets to use a bunch of fun gadgets, but he gets captured. Even Goldfinger, like after he's captured, Goldfinger is impressed by his car.
Oh, that interesting car of yours.
And then Goldfinger introduces his own gadget, this powerful laser.
I too have a new toy. You are looking at an industrial laser.
But now, before we talk about the laser, you know, they actually built that car. Like back then, Mike, they would build these things so that they really worked to a great extent. You know, they wouldn't just like use a Aston Martin and then just CGI stuff. So they built a car that actually had rotating license plates. It had an ejector seat. It had machine gun turrets. It had bulletproof things that would pop up. It had oil and other kind of smoke stuff that would spurt out the back.
Right.
And you could activate all these things. It was a fully functioning gadget car. Of course, you know, they didn't have like real bullets in it, but
but how many cup holders did it have?
Yeah, 2. Now, we all know that lasers are powerful and exist today, but back when that movie was filmed, they didn't.
Is that right?
You know, we watch that movie today and we just take it for granted. Oh, powerful laser. Yeah, of course. But but back then it didn't even exist really. So, he's, you might say torturing Bond because he's got him strapped to a table and he turns on the laser and it's slowly creeping up the table to like cut Bond in half, right?
Yes.
Now, do you know that the effect of that shot, because they show a close-up of the table, like the laser burning through the table.
Right.
It's done because there's a guy under the table with an actual blowtorch.
No.
Yeah.
Don't give it away, Doug.
Oh, I'm serious. And Connery was actually on the table. It's not like a stunt man,
Yeah. Yeah.
Connery's on the table, and he said later on that the table was actually getting really hot and he was getting nervous.
Do you expect me to talk?
No, Mr. Bond, I expect you to die.
And so Bond convinces Goldfinger not to kill him. And so, in turn, he is politely kidnapped. And this is a classic thing. You got to love Bond villains because they're polite. Bond is polite and they're polite in response. They kidnap him politely. He gets on the plane, everyone's very nice. They serve him drinks. They let him change into that excellent 3-piece gray suit. Mike, this is undoubtedly one of the most famous suits ever made, to be honest. It's a gray Glen plaid 3-piece ensemble bespoke suit, handmade by Anthony Sinclair in London.
Wow.
And it continues to be apparently Sinclair's most requested design.
Wow.
Yeah, Mike, you can get it online for about $3,000.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, 3,000. And if you mention our promo code of PAAM, you might get a little bit more off the purchase price. All right, so now on the plane, he meets the pilot, who's this woman, and she's apparently the quote-unquote Bond woman. Right. And she's one of the more absurd Bond women's names. So I'm not even going to say the name because, back then it was sort of funny, but these days people get offended.
Yeah.
And so let's just say that she's played by Honor Blackman. She does a great job playing a strong female character who can pilot a plane.
I'm a damn good pilot.
And also knows judo.
Right. She has a scene where she's having like a judo match with Bond in the hay.
Yeah, she tosses him around. She pulls some moves. And apparently she learned judo when she was doing that TV show Avengers. And so they bring Bond as a guest to Goldfinger's Bluegrass, Kentucky resort. And he's treated nicely. He gets to spy on Goldfinger, as Goldfinger is giving his criminal pitch to a bunch of mobsters.
Yeah. I also love the mobsters in that scene. They're very like, what are you talking about? Who do you think? They just have that very.
Yeah. I mean, they're classic mobster portrayal. One guy's like, I didn't know Chicago was going to be here. Who invited the West Coast?
Right.
Yeah. And the set design, like this is like a great room in the resort where the mobsters are playing pool. They're drinking at this huge bar, waiting for Goldfinger. And so Goldfinger comes up. He flips a switch and the pool table turns over into this elaborate control panel. All the mobsters are confused because the floor is moving around and on the windows close up and like all these maps drop from the ceiling. Like everything in the room changes. And the mobsters are like, what the hell, Goldfinger?
What are you trying to pull, Goldfinger?
And so Goldfinger reveals his plan, Mike, as you know, which is to attack Fort Knox. And Goldfinger, he's got a great speech, Mike. I think this is one of the great villain speeches. He says, Man has climbed mountains, gone to the moon, split the atom, everything but one thing, crime!
Man has climbed Mount Everest, achieved miracles in every field of human endeavor, except crime.
Right. I mean, that's what we need to conquer. Is we need to master crime.
Yeah. Now, we talked about how the villains have a cordial relationship with Bond. At this bluegrass resort, they're sitting outside, nice day, drinking mint juleps. And Bond is saying, Goldfinger, I've worked out the numbers, and 15 billion in gold weighs, blah, blah, blah.
Weighs 10,500 tons. 60 men would take 12 days to load it onto 200 trucks.
And I love how he's like reasoning it out real time, and Goldfinger is like gleefully urging him along, like, "Oh yes, you've almost got it." And then I really love that Bond concludes basically by saying, like, he commends the villain, you know.
I apologize, Goldfinger. It's an inspired deal. Brilliant.
Goldfinger and his little army, they attack and they breach Fort Knox, and they go into the vault. Now, you know, Mike, the filmmakers, they wanted to see Fort Knox to get a feel for like how to portray it, right?
Okay.
But they weren't even allowed to visit like outside, let alone see inside.
Right.
Apparently, they said that even the president of the U.S. isn't allowed inside Fort Knox. I guess you can't even trust the president not to swipe a gold bar.
And who was the president in 1964 when they made the movie?
I don't know.
Johnson.
Yeah, well, definitely don't let him in Fort Knox. And so Goldfinger gets in there with the atomic bomb, right?
Mm-hmm.
They've recaptured Bond and they handcuff him to the bomb, and they set the timer, leaving Oddjob trapped inside with Bond and the bomb.
Bond and the bomb.
All right, Mike. And so now you know it's Bond versus Oddjob since Bond gets out of the handcuffs, right?
Right.
And it's a great fight scene. You know, Oddjob is throwing his hat. Throwing his hat at Bond. You know, missing him, but breaking electric cables.
Yep.
Bond is throwing gold bars at Oddjob and they just bounce off his chest. He finds like a piece of lumber and smacks Oddjob over the head with it and does nothing. Just like breaks. And Oddjob is like tossing Bond all over using his judo, right? You know?
Yep.
And there's this classic scenes of just like Bond sliding across the floor because Oddjob tosses him. And the floors are just like really nice granite floors.
Mm-hmm.
Well waxed, by the way. They've got a good maintenance crew at Fort Knox.
Evidently.
And then at the end here, Mike, I love that Bond, you know, he gets the bomb casing open. And he looks inside and it's this totally confusing mix of spinning wheels and wires and lights.
Wow.
Bond is scratching his head like, what do I do? Do I pull this? Do I pull that? And then finally a government guy gets into the vault and rushes over and he just reaches in and flips a switch to turn it off.
Yeah.
Who knew, Mike, that you didn't have to mess
for
around with like, oh, what wire do I have to cut? You just look for the on-off switch.
Yeah.
And it classically stops. You know, the timer stops, set to the time 007, Mike.
Oh, I did not notice that.
Ooh, that's kind of funny. Another little fun Bondism. All right, Mike. And then here's the last bit that defines another Bond icon. You think everything's over, but Bond faces a little mini battle surprise at the last moment. And in this film, Goldfinger pops up while he's in a plane heading out of town now. And they fight. They fight over his golden gun, which blows open a window and it sucks Goldfinger out. You know, he gets stuck in the window. It's powerful suction when you blow out a window in a plane, Mike.
Yeah, but he's corpulent, so that's why he gets stuck.
Exactly. But he's not corpulent enough because he eventually gets stuck and then he gets pulled out. Kind of like Augustus Gloop in Willy Wonka.
Yeah.
He gets stuck briefly and then whoop.
What happened? Where's Goldfinger?
Playing his golden harp.
And so, Mike, you know, all in all, this film, it set the groundwork for all the rest of the Bond films, you know, set the template, the attributes that kept defining the Bond films over the next 60 years, really.
Yeah. Wow.
Well, Mike, I think that summarizes our topics for today.
Yes. Very good.
All right. Well, for all of us here at Politics in a Movie, thank you for listening. And you can check out our website at politicsandamovie.com. Thank you, Mike.
Thanks, Doug.
And thank you, Frenchie.
Who are you?
My name is Galore.
I must be dreaming.